Okay, we are live.
Okay, welcome to another exciting program here on Portal to Ascension and New Realities. I'm Alan Steinfeld, and this is a kind of preview for an upcoming 3-day epic event, as Neil Gar likes to say, at Portal to Ascension, which is True World History, where we have about 20 or so different speakers going into what really is, here it is, True World History. You have some fantastic speakers, including the two with me today, Jamie Janover and Adam Apollo. But we also have JJ Hurtak, we have Brad Olson, we have Paul Wallace, we have Dr. Sam, who discovered the Bosnian pyramids. We have Surian White. These are people who've really devoted their lives to understanding and investigating what is our ancient past. Freddie Silver is going to be there, another fantastic mind and investigator. Michael Tellinger, really fantastic. Sarah Cosme, who's doing her own intuitive psychic investigations with people's past lives. Sharia Dharma. So this is a fantastic 3-day event, full on 3 days. Go to portal2ascension.org to register. And we're going to have a little preview of some of the things we'll be talking about with today's guests. And I want to thank Neil Gore for making this possible. Thank you, Neil. Adam Apollo, I call him the captain of the starship. You know, he is he has combined ancient history with future knowledge and off-world understandings of ancient civilization and extraterrestrial civilizations. So I know him a little more than Jamie Janover, who I've seen you at conferences, Jamie. I know you're part of the Nassim team there, Residence Project. You've studied that sacred geometry and ancient civilizations with him and on your own. So I am really interested in what you both have to say because, you know, I just came back from a month in Egypt. And what no one had told me up until this trip, there seems to be two definite civilizations that existed there, you know, before the Common Era. There was the dynastic Egypt, which had the hieroglyphs and all those fancy temples. And then there's something that seemed much older. That's maybe I'm calling the megalithic civilization, with these huge, hundreds of ton blocks, no hieroglyphics, and maybe 10 or 20, 30,000 years old. I think the pyramid was part of that. So can you go, Jamie, are you familiar with what I'm talking about? These two different levels of civilization, and explain to me what went on there and what's the gap between those. So just
I think
interesting.
the challenge is that Egyptology is considered to be a science practically. And
Yeah.
these guys that first went to Egypt to start to try to figure out what was going on, I'd say, I mean, people have been trying to figure out what's happened with Egypt and the history of how all these objects that have been built there got there. But starting in the 1800s, you know, European, Western folks showed up in Egypt and was like, oh, I don't know how this got here, but here's what I think. And they set out their theory and it kind of stuck. It just stuck. People were like, oh, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, sure. The dynastic Egyptian, you know, the pharaohs built all these pyramids and built all these temples. And, you know, that we know roughly what date that is. And that got put into textbooks. It got into the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? And all the school kids before the internet were like, oh, Egypt. And I remember busting out an encyclopedia and being like, oh, yeah, the pyramids with the slaves, with the stones, right? The pharaoh was like, make me a tomb. And they pulled all the stones. I mean, you've heard the story a million times. And that's what you call dynastic Egypt. But like you were saying, there's evidence, a lot of it at this point, showing that this is not probably correct. And this is the same story that happens in a lot of sciences. For a long time, we thought things were a certain way. And then some brilliant person goes, actually, I know you guys all think it's like this, but according to my calculations, whether it be physics, chemistry, biology, history, anthropology, archaeology, any ology you want to name, the whole story of the game is that everybody's like, oh, this is the deal. Write some books, put it in the textbooks, sell those textbooks to the colleges so the kids can open it and learn the stuff. And then we realize that's not correct and we have to revise. And so then We have to print more textbooks and say, this is now how we think things are. And boy, is stuff changing rapidly right now with the modern technologies that we have to gather data on all sorts of things. It's starting to really cement the idea that our whole story of how this all got here is incorrect. And so, you can call that dynastic and pre-dynastic, and it's probably mostly pre-dynastic. And then the dynastic Egyptians, the pharaohs, showed up, and a bunch of this stuff was already there. And King Ramses II was like, sweet, this is awesome. Carve my name on that right away. Put my name on everything.
Exactly.
And if there's already a name on that, chisel it away and put my cartouche. Right. A cartouche is a pill-shaped oval, right, with some characters in it that say the name of the pharaoh, and you see them all over the place. And then there's these structures that, for some reason, don't have hieroglyphs. Like everything practically has hieroglyphs on it. You mean like floors, ceilings, columns, doesn't matter. Just wall-to-wall literal hieroglyphs, except, strangely enough, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Assyrian Temple in Abydos, the Serapeum at Saqqara. There are these massive, super accurate stones that have been cut that have no hieroglyphics. And in some cases, like the boxes inside of the Serapeum, some not very skilled guy goes, it's almost like a cartoon with uneven lines that are all jaggedy and
they really tried to mark it. That's for sure.
On this absolutely perfectly polished dolerite surface that looks like it might have been treated with chemicals or something. We don't even know. We couldn't even do it today if we wanted to. So all bets are off, and it's a very confusing story because all the kids are being told incorrect things to this day.
Well, thank you for. No, thank you. You're right. And what's wrong with just saying, hey, we don't know? It's sort of where we're at with the UAP situation. We're finally getting people, scientists that are coming forward and say, well, I don't really know what's going on. So we can learn something about just saying, I don't know. So Adam, I know you have a lot to say about this kind of gap in civilizations and the kind of take over the brainwashing, the marketing of the Western mind, let's call it. And go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's a lot easier to say you don't know when you haven't already said what you claim and think is the truth, right? It's a lot easier to be like, well, this is a mystery, we're still solving the mystery, than it is to backtrack from a series of theories that have already been laid down. And the dynastic period that Jamie talks about, that's approximately 5,000 years of history that we think academically and collectively that we know what happened, right? That goes back to around 3000 BC or so. And we've made assumptions, and really you gotta have compassion for these guys, right? Because initially a lot of it was, British archaeologists going around from their very advanced civilization standpoint, because they drink tea in the afternoons, and looking at these sites and going, well, I guess they must have just dragged these stones and stacked them up. And they must have just chiseled this thing out. I mean, it's a giant thing, but they must have had tons of slaves who chiseled it out. Now, these guys had zero experience in, say, geology in many cases. They had zero experience in engineering. They're not thinking about the physics that it would require to, say, rotate one of the rose granite pillars in Saqqara, Egypt, that's 50 feet tall, perfectly round, and would have taken a 2-story tall diamond saw along with a rotating panel to turn the thing that's the size of a freight train, right? They never postulated the actual engineering effort. And so you end up with all of this groundwork laid, and a lot of the groundwork is great because they did look at, here's a sequence of, this pharaoh, and they had these children, and they told this story. There's a lot of translations of a lot of hieroglyphics that was actually quite difficult. But as Jamie said, in many cases, a lot of the really, really amazing sites were just reused, retaken, and renamed for a different purpose. And once that new purpose was there, that it generally was the accepted purpose of that dynasty or that society. But the gap back to where some of those places were actually built, like when we look at, for example, the Sphinx Temple, the Great Pyramid of Giza, where the structures and the stones, the Serapeum as well, are in the 70 to 100 to sometimes 150 or 200 ton range in size. These were not dragged by people. They couldn't be. If you've ever seen, you can go look, and some of these have become memes on social media of just big stones, that were in the 70 to 50 ton size, sometimes 100 ton size stone, and they're crushing the back of semi trucks. That period is 13,000 years ago. That period is pointing to the time prior to our current academic history, a time that's often called the pre-Diluvian era, or the time before the Lesser Dryas, or just after the Lesser Dryas. There's an interesting, gigantic gap here to civilizations that existed prior to the history we know about. And those civilizations clearly had technology that was able to bore holes through stone, that was able to lift massive gargantuan structures and put them into precise positions, and we see evidence of that in not only Egypt, but of course other areas of the world like Peru.
So let's do a little speculation. I mean, we're not saying we know, but John West, who I studied, interviewed a bunch of times, big influence in this field of ancient Egypt. He was the first to bring a geologist there, Robert Schoch, and say, "Yep, there was water weathering on the Sphinx. This was not caused by an occasional rain." So he said to me, actually, and probably other places, that the further you go back in Egyptian monuments, the more complex the structures are. And he says this may indicate what he would say in public, the A word, Atlantean. Of course, he was run out of academic, what he called the quackademics, Egyptology would never go along with it. But it's obvious he was onto something big. So if we go back to the megalithic structures, and then there was maybe a gap, which was maybe the flood or something, where's the origin of those huge, the Serapeum? I had never been there before. I was in Egypt once before it was sort of kind of brought out. It's like, oh my God, what's going on there? This is fantastic. So where's it come from, and how can we start? I mean, this is what I say about ETs. We're not going to understand the technology until we understand how they think. So how did these beings think about their world? Who were they? And did they leave a legacy for us today? I know those are lots of questions. Jamie, you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that this paradigm is being flipped upside down right now. And there's resistance because there's an entire multiple generations of people that have been like, this is how it goes. And now we have all kinds of new data and new technologies. And for example, just in geology alone, when the Egyptologists came up with their theories about how old ancient Egypt structures are, they didn't really understand as much as we do today about geology. And the geology is more reliable, I would say, in terms of straight data, because you can make observations directly instead of hypothesizing, like, look at these layers. Let's start doing carbon dating. Let's start looking at all this information. And when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, the entire story of the entire planet is different. So Egypt is only just one little tiny patch of the planet, right? And all over the planet, there's evidence that shows that for sure there was like a lot of folks around and they were figuring out how to make incredible structures. And then bad things happened, as they do in the universe, right? Like planets only last for so many billion years. Eventually something hits and something hits something else, and it causes all kinds of stuff to fly around and land on the earth. And
Until
boy,
you're
can that
managing
have
your
a
solar
big
system,
consequence,
of course.
right? The dinosaur comet was 65 million years ago. We were not building stuff probably 65 million years ago, but 12,500 years ago, there was
So,
all kinds of stuff that happened right and caused the Younger Dryas, this cooling period, because all this material, whether it be a comet, whether it be meteors, or if it be sun flare, which is what Robert Schoch thinks, planetary wide cataclysms happened, and everybody who was around smartly was living near the ocean for obvious reasons, right? Why would you want to live near the ocean? And then because all this polar ice cap melted in a matter of weeks, the sea levels rose by something like 400 feet. Well documented. Thank you, Graham Hancock, for calling attention to this whole thing, and Randall Carlson. And so, like, it's now hitting Netflix, right? You've got Graham Hancock, the lead researcher, of sticking his neck out and saying, "Yeah, I think stuff's a lot older than you guys think." He's been vindicated very, very much recently, and he got a lot of flack for that series on Netflix. And then only like about a couple weeks ago, Gadang Padang in Java, this hill that they're like, oh, cool, some guys put some rocks on this hill. No, they dug down into the layers of that hill. It's a pyramid, and the ancient layers at the bottom are like 20,000 years plus carbon dating. And so that completely pulls the rug out on all of the theories that, oh yeah, we didn't really know what was going on. We came out of our caves like 10,000 years ago with our clubs, hunter-gatherer style, and started knocking some animals on the head, and then figured out, oh, maybe we could start planting stuff. And they try to tell us in school that Mesopotamia or Samaria 6,500 years ago is when we got our act together and started writing stuff down and understanding how to build stuff. And then they started finding things like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and Gadang Padang in Indonesia. And they go, oh, whoops, actually move that date back. And then they're like, oh, wait, hold on. We just saw that there were some scratch marks on this mastodon tusk near San Diego where they were making a road. Actually, we think there were people hanging out in the United States 130,000 years ago. You're like, oh, really? That's a lot older than Mesopotamia. Yeah. So basically, we really don't know. And it's an exciting time to be in this transition from being completely clueless to having some clue that's pointing to a very different story than what we were told when we were kids.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. That's really exciting, just how you laid it out. And so, Adam, let's hypothesize a little bit. Who were the pre-Diluvian people, and were they connected around the planet through grids and pyramids? And what was the origin of that civilization? Can you, in one sentence? No, that all together. The ancient true history. The true. This is what we're trying to get to. The true world history. What do you make it?
Sure. Based on the data and information that I've gathered, as well as some of my own personal deep experiences and that of others that I've had memories with from other times who have recalled some of these events, it seems very clear to me that we've had waves of civilization that led up to what we call the end of the Ice Age and the Big Flood. That it goes back hundreds of thousands of years, that we had periods where there were certain temples and certain sites being built very, very long time ago, and that there was a seafaring exchange that was going on between locations around the planet. And then the ice expanded at some point. And when the ice expanded, we went into the Ice Age, we went into that cold period, it pushed all of the civilization around the part of the equator. So it forced a lot of civilization centers to come closer to the equator and within a particular kind of band of the planet. And at that point, with the amount of ice and all of that that's in the polar regions, you have really easy transportability to anywhere in the world because you can just cross the ice plates, right? Mm-hmm. And you could see this coming together, the sort of forced coming together of the peoples that had lived up until that time as a Renaissance stimulator, right? And so you have all of these different peoples from around the world, and if the memories and the direct, experiences and the deep recall and the tons and tons of data that we're getting that's coming out of states of hypnosis from people's memories from this period are true, then there was actually a lot of different star beings coming in from different places in the galaxy to join in with this sort of big party on Earth, because it looks like in this renaissance that it's time for this civilization to become part of the rest of the galactic civilization. The advancement curve is there, the arts is there, the unification of the planet is there, and there's a lot of people that would deeply agree with me and say that yes, we were trying to, essentially have a planetary renaissance and reach the stars. And of course, if we look in historical narrative, we see that narrative very clearly laid out. It's described, in tales going back to the days of Babylon, and it's discussed as the Tower of Babel. The humans building this sort of, one structure to reach the gods. But you can think of that one structure as the Atlantean civilization, a civilization of great cities interconnected, in which the human species is trying to reach the gods and become gods themselves. But as we dramatize things, and the Greeks, of course, loved to do this, and so did the Mesopotamians and others, we said, well, then, God got angry and just smashed the Tower of Babel and forced us all apart. Well, it probably doesn't actually look like that. It probably looks a lot more like Gaia, the earth going through big changes, and the end of that period had to happen. The end of the Ice Age had to happen, and those floods were going to happen. And some peoples around the world were probably more prepared for that than others. Some had information, some were ready, some built things underground, some prepared and took ships to higher ground. There was a contingency plan in case of civilization destruction. But unfortunately, that curve to Earth becoming part of this galactic society was not able to happen. And in that reset, what happens is all of the peoples end up in all these different areas of the world and now continue their work, but less connected. And so developed out of the little tribal dialects and regional dialects and things that they had, we start having the full development of all these different languages. And of course, there may be origins for the roots of those languages as well among the stars, as some of the mathematics, gematria and some of the incredible work that Robert Grant has done looking at language similarities across different systems. And I've done some of that work as well. And what we see is sort of these super highly advanced ancient interconnections between measurement systems, languages, mathematics. And where did it all come from? We have no idea. It goes back as old as we can get. And then all of a sudden there's a big gap between that and it's like cuneiform, and it's like very much, chisel and hammer and, let's just put a mark here and put a mark there. But there's some point where suddenly that's very advanced, and then that very advanced structure forms a root structure of knowledge and information that then persists in all of these cultures around the world and then arises and is told mostly as mythological memory. It's mythological stories of origin, of gods and goddesses, of great floods, and all of these things that then we have as our primary archaeological evidence going into today.
I appreciate that, because as you're talking, I'm thinking maybe one day we'll be considered an ancient civilization,
Sure.
And
yeah.
No doubt.
and we're
Every
at
civilization
a
does.
particular. Right. But also we're at that turning point where we have a global civilization. We're connected. And where will we go, guys? Are we going to go the way of the past, the way of the dodo? Or do we reach the stars as a planetary conscious? I think that's why studying the past is so important for where we are right now. I mean, What do you think, Jamie? What do you think about how do we hold on to a potential planetary civilization that's emerging so we can meet these beings that want us to wake up?
I am fairly optimistic, actually, even though it looks like stuff is going south left and right all over the planet, I think we forget how far we've come and how much better off the average human is today than they were even only a few years ago, never mind 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. And the advancements that we're seeing in AI and the way that we're going to start to integrate computers, language models, and our technology, I would encourage folks to like start looking at videos related to modern technologies interfacing with people, because starting out with, say, like people that can't communicate, that are paralyzed and can't speak, and they're perfect brains, like they're in their mind, they've got every single thing going on and they can't communicate. That's got to be one of the most challenging situations for any human. And now we're getting to the point where we're going to be able to read brainwaves and translate that. Not only that, there's all the prosthetics that are being developed right now for war victims that have been having limbs missing. They're figuring out how to graft titanium into bones and with electrodes, so that not only can you send impulses down and move the hand, but the hand has sensors on it and you can feel and send those messages back up into the bone, because bone cells will grow right onto titanium. They figured that out in the 50s. And now we've got the technology and the electronics to be able to send signals both ways, right? So like, holy mackerel, is that a change? And that's just in the last few years. So yeah, when we're an ancient civilization and they look back, it'll be like, wow, look at that. They did all that stuff before they had all those other technologies. Wow, those guys were really roughing it back in the day. That's going to be the situation right now. It's hard to have that perspective. So I appreciate that you're calling that out, because we are going to head to a really cool place, I think, where the amount of human suffering on average is going to go down. It's going to go down by a bunch. And that's good. Less pain and suffering is good.
I agree.
And having more fun is good. And we're going to have a lot of fun too, because as we get these technologies to leverage work for us, the average amount of work that we have to do goes down. And we're going to start to have hopefully some universal income happening, because the paradigm is flipping from the control structures of the powerful having all the technology and all the knowledge. It's now distributed. Now every kid can just go, hold on, wait, I want all the world's knowledge. Oh, thankfully it's in my hand right now. And I can just decide to like figure out whatever I want and do whatever I want and make whatever I want. And because of that, the awareness and the knowledge of the systems is going up. And so is the awareness and the knowledge that the power structures have been telling us, this is how things work. This is how everything came. Our book says it's like this. And so you better listen to our book. And the kids are going, I don't know, because I just read all the books. Right. And they all say something slightly different. So I appreciate your perspective. However, and that has not been the case for the kids for a long time. It was just like, okay, I got an A in class because I answered the question. Now it's like, no, I'm thinking for myself. And that's times 8 billion. So we're off to a good start, I think, even though things aren't perfect yet. We're heading towards having more knowledge, more coherency, more getting along, and more treating the world like a giant festival instead of, winner takes all, dog eat dog style, which is the old paradigm that I hopefully start reducing.
Thank you for that, because I know Adam's one of the architects for the future, and you have it you have a map for your particular way. Do you want to give us some of that, but also somehow connect it to the ancient past? As you make this loop.
Well, yeah, I'll also I want to speak a little bit to what Jamie was sharing as well, because I'm passionate about these topics, and it tends to be that I'm on panels, being the guy that's trying to defend the good trajectory for humankind, while others are spreading massive, fear and, oh my God, we're in some serious trouble, and AI is going to come over and kill us, and it's an ancient galactic being trying to destroy us and stuff like that, which doesn't by the way, match any of the memories, stories, hypnosis histories, etc., of anybody who I know who's an actual experiencer. So I just want to point that out to start before I go into this. And I'll also say that we're in a really tricky time in which, because there is this massive wave of information that's now accessible, where I see some of the groups that are interested in maintaining control on this planet playing the game a little bit more now is less like trying to force people to understand something through the school system and more attempting to do psychological manipulation by creating an emotional reaction around particular pieces of information or knowledge. And, you can see, if you watch The Great Hack and the technology that was developed by Cambridge Analytica, you can begin to see the way that a powerful technology that understands people's emotional and, the emotional drivers that make them choose to do and or be a certain way in the world, then those drivers can be pushed, those triggers can be pushed, and people can be mobilized to make decisions that otherwise they would not make. And I believe that we've been facing a lot of that over the past 5 to 10 years. And we can see the effects of some of these intense psychological pushes creating division if we just start with, say, the flat earth, theory, for example, and how much the conscious community got divided around that, to QAnon, and it's, you're either believe everything QAnon says or you're, a cabal member who's basically serving the dark forces that want to destroy the planet and you want to kill babies. Like, that's a pretty strong emotional divide to be put in, especially when there's all these claims coming from a group like that are not panning out. They're not showing themselves to be true. There is no way to validate it, right? And then you have things like COVID, a massive period of division between people where, for some, the idea is that if you don't take the vaccine, you're trying to murder your grandparents, right? And for others, it's like, well, if I do take the vaccine, then I'm essentially buying into a giant story told by the pharmaceutical industry that I'm going to die and explode, if I don't. And I'm not into that, and I'm not willing to go down that pathway. And people really got at odds. And now it's happening around Tartaria, which, this touches into the ancient history piece, and it's happening around AI. So there have been different areas for lines to be drawn to divide us. And I note this and I watch this happen all the time. I see it in conferences. I see it in all my panels. But the thing is that if we actually touch into the greater historical narrative of who we are, if we understand the improvements of life over history, if we understand that there was an advanced civilization building incredible things back in the time before the end of the last ice age, then we start to get a glimpse of what the real historical narrative looks like. And we build logic, right? We strengthen our logical analysis so that when you do hear a story about something like, say, Tartaria, right? And you see, that you're right, these Art Deco buildings are super advanced looking. Like, how did they do that? How did they pull those off? And whoa, you're right, they do look like antennas, or these temples look like antennas. Were they tapping electricity? And was there this like super amazing civilization that existed and that it was like then hidden from us, in a mud flood? And like, was this all buried, back in the 1850s, and that there was this super advanced thing and then it disappeared in the 1850s? And you look at that and it's like, wow, that's a really interesting idea. It's a really fantastic construction of thought. And it's one that's based on a feeling that our history is false. And that feeling that our history is false is partially true because we are missing Atlantis in our history. We are missing this huge span of civilization, past 5,000 years ago, going back to 13,000. We know we're missing pieces, right? And people desire to know what those pieces are. And the idea that those pieces could be so close to our lives and somehow blocked out is very appealing. However, there are huge logical problems with it. All you have to do is ask the question, where did all the books in the library come from? And this is where the whole thing about the libraries of our physical written knowledge and the power of the digital knowledge, it's almost like we're in this very interesting era where it's just as important to look at the physical evidence, the actual books, what's in paper, what's been laid down, what's been actually created, as it is to look at all of the digital information. Because the digital information can give us any answer. But the reality is that the vast amount of books that were published between the 1500s and now, a huge amount of those books were published between 1750 and 1850. And if we don't look at that and we don't say, well, then why didn't all of these millions of books that people painstakingly wrote, how come not one of them talks about this advanced civilization existing in that period? It just doesn't, it completely goes outside of the logic. And it means that we have to distrust the millions of people who wrote those books. It means we have to distrust our grandparents. It means we have to distrust so many people to believe this story is true. And to me, and also the violent reactions people get when I ask them questions about it, that shows me that this is an emotionally manipulated disinformation campaign. And it is designed to divide us and to create greater separation. And I saw the same thing happen with Flat Earth. And so this is where I petition to the people listening to this to continue to use your logic, your discernment, ask the hard questions, and keep digging, because you're on the right track with the curiosity, but you got to keep pulling the thread deeper, because the real mystery of our origins going back to the days of Atlantis is so much more amazing, and that truth, and also acknowledging the truth that yes, we improved the building of stone castles from the period of the Dark Ages to fantastic structures in the Middle Ages to unbelievably beautiful churches and structures during the Renaissance. And that is actually honoring the masons who developed those techniques and built those things. And if we just pretend that, oh, there's no way, that happened and that we don't build structures like that now, I have to just remind people, well, that most structures we build now, we build on a budget. And we don't want to spend a lot of time. We don't want to use long-lasting materials. We build paper mache, glass and steel skyscrapers.
I totally agree with you, Adam. It's so frustrating when I talk to the Tartarians and the flat earth people, because there's no sense of history with those people. They don't study. It's like all of a sudden some probably, intelligence group is saying, let's make these people look really stupid, because if they believe flat earth, then the whole UFO thing, it just tarnishes the whole thing. So
whole movement.
Yeah,
the whole movement. I mean, it takes away the credibility of the rest of the movement. And the UFO world, and Alan, you and I know this so well, being in all the work in the UFO space for a long time. It's been so delicate, because all it takes is one really kooky person, making outlandish claims, and the credibility of all of these hard researchers that have spent decades doing work is now under question. And then you get an entire conference where people are like, oh, that's just the crazy people, Yeah,
we had those infiltrations over the last couple of years that, I don't want to name names, but there were definitely people I wouldn't trust. And but now that you brought up the flat earth, one theory that's out there that is not so ludicrous perhaps is the expanding earth theory. If you look at a map, you can see the continents seem to be pulled away from each other, and some force, even the mid-Atlantic ridge seems to be, and the one in the Pacific is pouring Earth in, and there seems to be a drift that's happening. So what do you think? Like at some point, the Pangea idea was these civilizations were connected, and maybe it's quicker than we thought. But do you think there's a thing to the
I would love
expanding
to
Earth?
hear. I would love to hear Jamie's thoughts on that one because I
Yeah.
don't think we've had that discussion. Jamie and I, there was a period of a couple of years where he and I were kind of back to back teaming up on flat Earth posts and videos, like just taking it on and just listing like logical proof, logical proof, logical proof,
Of
like
course.
flights in the southern hemisphere. Our friends are in Antarctica. Like you measure this, you measure that, you look at the angle from the sun, et cetera, et cetera. We would just
And everything's a
decimate
sphere
these flat
anyway
Earth
in
theories.
3D. So I know.
But
So
yeah, I want to hear Jamie. I want to hear
Yeah,
your
that was a
take on this
challenging
one.
period. I learned the hard way that it's better, I think, for me personally, to put my attention towards amplifying really resonant, really cool, really forward-thinking ideas and getting the wheels turning on the people that are ready to have their wheels turning in a positive direction instead of trying to correct anything that I think needs correcting. I'm just not interested in trying to do that in that way anymore. I really
older and wiser, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting exercise to see if you could try to speak logic to people that were not being logical, and it wasn't good for me. It was
frustrating. It's awful.
kind of hurt me, and I think now looking back on it, I think that a lot of the stuff that we think is some sort of conspiracy is just a bunch of bored people behind internet screens and being like, oh, I can do anything because like no one knows who I am. So let's see what happens if I pretend I'm a guy and I'll give myself a name and say that I'm in the CIA. And like that guy was like, oh my God, it's working.
Or was the CIA making everyone look stupid?
And now I got to run with this thing. And then, oh no, I think they might have figured out who I am. I better go dark. That seems like what that happened.
Yeah, I've seen it too.
Same thing could have happened with flat Earth or anything else, But
what do you think of the expanding Earth? And also, I think there are possibly hollow Earth ideas.
This is crucial because the thing is about expanding Earth. If the Earth is expanding or if planets are expanding, it would happen very gradually. So gradually that even with the history of our telescopes observing spheres that we can see, we won't be able to detect the level of growth that we're talking because it's happening over hundreds of millions and billions of years. But it is true that you can computer model the Earth and then just start shrinking it in the computer and let the oceans disappear, but the continents don't get that much smaller. And any 6-year-old kid can see South America and Africa and be like, oh, look, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Those coastlines would fit together. It's like, yeah, they do. And it doesn't seem obvious, but even in the Pacific, when you start shrinking the Earth, all the continents fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, that's cool. But now what? What if we did that to every planet and every moon in the solar system? Titan's got all these lines all over it. It looks like a crossword puzzle or something. That one, if you start shrinking it, it's not a coincidence if all those lines start to like. So you can start shrinking all these different structures. And so there is some evidence pointing to the possibility that spheres, including stars and planets and moons, are growing, that they're not static, that they change. And so how would that work? How would that happen? It gets pretty involved. But if you check out the work of Nassim Haramein, he's saying that he thinks that there's a singularity or a black hole basically in the center of just about everything, including the proton, but also the Earth, the sun, the galaxy. People are like, what do you mean? Well, when we first looked at the galaxy, we thought, oh, cool, a bunch of stars got in the same area, and then they started to get closer together because of gravity, and then they started spinning, and then they created a black hole in the center of the galaxy, when it's actually the opposite way. It's actually that the black hole formed, it's a vortex in space-time, and shearing off the event horizon of that come smaller black holes called stars that then orbit the big black hole. And then that black hole called a star makes smaller black holes inside of it called atoms. All of our atoms that we're made of came out of stars. Thank you. And so it's a whole different model. And so this is now, we're talking physics. We're not talking ancient Egypt. But the funny thing is you go deep into the physics and you curve all the way back around to being like, well, if that's true, then maybe that means that ancient people had some sort of knowledge of this, because look, they're making structures that are in resonance with and showing you very specific mathematical proportions related to that physics. And so I don't have obviously time to go into unified field theory because that's very long topic. But that's where that comes from. The Earth could be growing because it has a black hole in the center of it, and it's creating more atoms. And so the Earth is growing. This is very controversial. There are a lot of people out there, including physicists, that are rolling their eyes at that one. We're a little ahead of our time, but I have a feeling that it's gonna come out that we don't really understand the way that the universe formed and the way stars and planets form. James Webb has thrown a real monkey wrench. They're starting to go, wait a minute, we're seeing fully formed gigantic galaxies from only 300 million years after the Big Bang. That's not supposed to happen. That couldn't have happened that way. So actually, maybe the Big Bang was, 28 billion years ago now, they're saying. Forget 13.82 billion. It's now 24, 26, 28 billion years old. We have no idea, you guys.
Right. No, I appreciate the perspective, and I love Nassim because he was quite an innovator, and hopefully in the future he'll be appreciated by mainstream science who finally understand the weight of the proton, and that, real dark matter is made up of the missing matter that they're not measuring in the proton and all that. But one more thing, just getting off the subject of ancient civilization, did Nassim ever talk about the black hole inside us, inside the human heart, which makes the heart beat? That's one of my theories. Did you ever talk about
the ancients talked about it all the time. The Bindu point in the center of your heart chakra is your own personal black hole, according to Nassim's theory. And so you do have a vortex of singularity, of stillness in the center. And the ascended masters of this planet for thousands of years have been trying to tell us in every possible way they could think of telling us before the invention of physics to point your attention into the center of your existence and get still. Because, the biggest hurricane ever recorded had the biggest, coldest, stillest eye of the hurricane ever recorded. So if you really want to spin out, you got to get still. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the stiller you can get, the more your outer sphere is spinning.
Beautiful. So let's get back, Adam, to a little bit of ancient civilization, because I still, there's so much unanswered, and we're of course not getting it from academics, and we have to kind of do our own research. So who seeded the Earth? Where did it evolve from? Because I know you're connected to the planetary civilizations. Do you think it was a panspermia where they just planted us here as Adam and Eve, sort of, or were they put down as evolved humans that de-evolved? What's your theory about the beginnings of Earth civilization?
Yeah, that's a tough one because there's mixed data and there's mixed information about all of it. I'd say before diving onto that, I'll just riff on Jamie's input there a little bit and just say, I think it's extraordinarily fascinating that even just our current understanding of the age of the universe, one of the extension pieces of work that I did off of quantum gravity and the holographic mass, which was Nassim's sort of formative paper on the proton and the relationship between the proton and the universe, is to assess the number of quantum vacuum oscillations in the proton versus the size of the universe and the age of the universe. And it turns out that our estimation of the age of the universe lines up such that there's exactly the same order of magnitude of Planck seconds in the lifetime of the universe as there are quantum vacuum oscillations inside the proton. And based on that and geometric work, looking at the proton and looking at its structure, as well as some of the mass energy relationships that Nassim proposes between the mass energy of the proton and the whole universe, I came to the conclusion that the protons are actually growing along with the life of the universe, that every proton is growing every Planck second. Now, whether that happens in a 1-to-1 ratio or if these new estimations of 26 billion years are true, then it's basically a 1-to-2 ratio. Like basically the proton is still would be growing with the age of the universe, just at a slightly different ratio of growth to the universal growth. And that, again, reaffirms the idea that planets are growing, stars are growing, and things are evolving. And when you get into the geology of Earth, it's really, really important to note that it's amazing how much we know about the inside structure of the Earth just from geological pulses and sending vibrations through the planet. It's amazing that we know that there's this, hot, wet magma mantle that's churning, down below this hard crust, that way down there, it's this hot vortexes of magma that are literally liquid metals as you get down towards the inner core. And that is generating the electromagnetic field of the planet, which is related to these ancient historical narratives. And then as you get down into the inner core, you've got the outer core and then the inner core. Well, the inner core, all we know about it is that it gets harder and harder and harder and tighter and tighter and tighter to a point where you've got literally an entire, we think of it as an iron metal crystal down there, right? But there's no way for us to know what's inside of that. What happens when that continues to pack harder and deeper? What's the mass energy relationship look like? There is no geologist on the planet, anyone who's studied the structure of the Earth, that can say definitively what's inside the inner core of the Earth. We don't know. And that means there's actually a huge, beautiful gap for a theory that suggests that perhaps it's a black hole core, for example, right?
And the deepest we've ever dug into the Earth is 10 miles. So everything else is just hypothesis.
This is like, you look at the Earth, and that's like, you've got a pinpoint, the tiny little prick in the top of, a gigantic, massive beach ball or something. Yeah, and we don't know that much.
Let's go back to our origins. So let's talk about the origins. Like
where did we all come from? Where did this all happen from? It's a tough thing to postulate, but I will say that based on some of the evidence that I've come across and data that I've come across, it does seem like there was some period of visitation on this planet in which there may have been some genetic manipulation that went on to an earlier version of humans. And this dating wise probably is in the range of the 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. And that in this period, or potentially vastly prior to that, there was, of course, at some point there was the hunter-gatherer tribal guys and the guys doing cave paintings and all of that did exist, definitely. And we know that we can go back all the way to Lucy, we can go way back into history to find these evidence points of the very early, very primitive human civilization. But then something does happen. There are changes in the way that civilization seems to operate. And, we find, for example, the evidence of all the structures across South Africa. You've got literally spans of what would seemingly be like the size of cities with hundreds of millions of people, the amount of these little circles that are built out of quartzite, which, by the way, when you take one of the stones in these stone circles that are all over South Africa and you hit them, they ring like bells. Michael Tellinger brought some of these to Kauai, where Jamie and I were building the Resonance Academy for Unified Physics on Kauai with Nassim. And they're amazing. And these things vibrate and resonate, and they're all over the place. And the archaeologists looking at this massive, massive infrastructure have just guessed, well, maybe they were cattle kraals, like they were used to keep cattle. Well, the amount of cattle that you would need to build those would be ridiculous. But the even more ridiculous thing is that they don't have doors. They're just circles, and they have branches coming off of them like a spider web, right? So there's not even doors going in and out of these things. Like, why would you have them? And, Michael's theory, which I thought was really good, is that maybe they were using them and getting these things vibrating, and they could resonate minerals up out of the ground. Gold harvesting, perhaps, something like that. We do have other archaeological evidence and as well as anthropological evidence that there was insane amounts of gold in southern Africa, and that the Zimbabwe kings had massive temples of gold. And a lot of that gold ended up in Egypt, and then of course all that gold was stolen essentially by the British and by other raiding empires who then took it wherever they wanted, right? And maybe there was a period where there was a civilization harvesting this gold to take it to another world or something like that. But it's difficult to line that up. And while I have a few friends who have some memories and some experience and familiarity with the Anunnaki and that period, and that have gone through a lot of their own healing and sort of karmic repair work from what they went through at that time, which did seem like, enslavement. It seemed like a level of control and domination over the human species or whatever we were at that particular point in time. And that is vastly different from the kind of galactic civilization and the memories and the species and the ways of life of the beings that I mostly know, who came here during the time of Atlantis, who came from worlds that essentially are, peaceful galactic civilizations in community with each other that have no need for resources from other planets because they've just figured out one really simple thing about space-time, and that's that it's geometric and energetic, and if you arrange it in the right way, you can produce whatever minerals or materials you want straight out of the quantum vacuum fluctuations. You don't need to mine gold if you can just produce it like a replicator. And it's hilarious because we literally almost have that technology right now. We almost can do that. We build gems one molecule at a time. We can literally assemble molecules and atoms together to construct different kinds of elements and materials. So we're already very close to being able to pull that off. Now, is it possible that there was an advanced civilization that didn't know how to do that, and that did have genetic knowledge and manipulated humanity a couple 100,000 years ago? Absolutely possible. And can we definitively say yes or no to that theory? No, we can't. Not at this stage. There's just not enough data. And unfortunately, it's hard enough just to define exactly what was going on 13,000 years ago, where we do have tons of evidence to be able to look at that and definitively know it was there. But again, we have to make theories and postulations, and we do our best to back those theories, or at least I do, through transpersonal psychological research, understanding the knowledge that's inside the memory of the souls and the people who were there at those particular times.
Right. No, thank you for that. Jamie, you want to talk about that, and then we'll wrap up. But what anything you have to say about the origins of
What do you think about the Anunnaki, Jamie? I don't know if I've heard you talk about that one much.
Well, as far as I can tell, the evidence that we have in terms of biological evolution, it's a pretty solid chain of evidence that shows how sapiens were changing, hominids were changing and evolving. And then a huge anomaly shows up where in a very short amount of time, evolutionary time, I'm talking, all of a sudden our cranium gets way bigger and we lose a bunch of our hair and we change dramatically into Homo sapien. And I would encourage folks to check out the work of William Brown, who looked at the DNA molecule and was like, yeah, this is very strange sequence over here. This looks like it might have been manipulated. And it's like, what? How? What do you mean manipulated? Talk about arranging molecules. We can edit DNA now, today, in the old days, way back in the ancient times. Like, we barely understand very much in medicine, in physics, but we can edit DNA right now. So it's actually not that hard if we can do it, right? So it's not that much of a stretch to think that if there's a civilization in the 13 billion years of the universe that came around, I don't know, let's say 1 million years ago, let's say 1 billion years ago, how much technology has changed since I was born is unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And we're only talking about decades. Never mind if some civilization was around for millions of years longer than us. They could have figured out gene editing millions of years ago and come along and seen Earth and been like, oh, cool. Yeah, let's just let that bake for another million years. We'll come back. No, it needs a few more million years. Let's just come back in like a billion years. Oh, now look, now they have mammals that have evolved, right? Like, okay, it's getting good. We're talking about long periods of time. It's hard to imagine, but they could have been like, hey, let's help this along. We need more folks that are going to think like we do. So let's just do a little gene editing down there and be like, okay, that's good. Just hang out. We'll wait for a while. And then, oh, no, didn't work. Something bad happened. They're not thinking quite right. Let's just wait for another cataclysm. And then the slate kind of gets cleaned and then they try it again. And so you got the Denisovans, you got the Neanderthals, you got Homo erectus, you've got all these species. And we were like, oh yeah, it's this chain and it goes like this. And then there's a missing link and that we heard about when we were kids. That missing link is like an entire missing roll of chain. It's not exactly one link. And then we're now realizing, wait a minute, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were having sex and having babies. And so are these species, and so are these species. And we have Neanderthal DNA inside of us right now as we sit here talking. So in other words, it's way more complex than we ever.
Right. I agree. There seems to have been an upgrade 200 or 50,000 years where suddenly writing and farming and all these civilization things happen. My other theory,
it's like we were genetically manipulated a long time ago, and
I think so.
Maybe they're checking us out right now, and it kind of makes sense. Gene Roddenberry was smart with Star Trek and the Prime Directive. If you have a spaceship and you go to a planet where there's people that don't understand about technology, you don't necessarily want to go, yeah, what's up? We're from a ship over there. Because then they start going, oh my God, and they start praying to you. If we landed in the jungle in a helicopter to the folks that are out in the Amazon rainforest who've never had any contact with modern folks, they might look at us and think that we're gods. We're like, no, we have this helicopter. It's just this thing where you burn stuff that we dug out of the ground and it spins a thing and it makes a pressure gradient in the atmosphere.
The cargo cult of the Pacific. Yeah, they called that
physics. And they're like, no, you're God. And we're like, no, we understand physics. That easily could have been the story. When the sun gods came, all the ancient civilizations were like, oh my God, write that down. Write that down. They're not typing. They're like, the sun gods came and they said they were from the stars and they were flying in an arc and all this stuff. Like, if you don't understand technology and physics, you have to describe all this stuff in very strange, esoteric ways. You might actually
archaeologists go.
Yeah, you might want to put a spear with wings over your temple entrance, or something.
Exactly.
What you see in Egypt.
You brought up Neanderthal. I have my own theory about Neanderthals, that they became multi-dimensional. I think they're actually the Bigfoots we can't find, because the Bigfoots are the evolution of the Neanderthals that became multi or interdimensional. That's just my way out theory. There's no proof. That's just any comment about that. And then I have one last question for you. Anyway, I guess not.
No comment on Bigfoot. No comment on Bigfoot, Alan. Carry on.
No, the final question, and you can tell how exciting these conversations are, and this is what the next 3 days are going to be like, with 20 different perspectives on what the true history of the world is at portaltoascension.org. Go register there. But the final question for today, anyway, I'll start with you, Jamie. What can we learn from the technology, from what's been left behind? How does that help us? Yeah, it's a mystery. It's great. You go to Egypt. It's like, how'd they build this? But what can we really learn from these civilizations that we can apply to our civilization today? If we can. I'd
say that it's that our reality, that our situation is a lot more complex and a lot more mysterious than we realize, and that there's very fundamental aspects of the universe that we are resonating with and built to interact with in a certain way. And if you just look at stuff on the surface and you just think about survival of the fittest or whatever, and you're just trying to find resources so you can eat and all that stuff, you're kind of missing an entire multiple dimensional realm of more subtle energy and ways of interacting with the universe.
Right.
A good example is that the electromagnetic spectrum has a lot of information riding on it, from gamma rays, microwaves, cosmic rays, the audible spectrum and the visible spectrum. Our ears are only perceiving such a tiny little band of the electromagnetic spectrum, and our eyes are only experiencing in that little tiny band. And so it's kind of like, as humanity, we've been looking at the universe through a cocktail straw, where you just see this one little tiny speck, and then you move it around a bunch, and you're like, oh yeah, oh cool, I see what's going on. Yeah, I got it. Here's how the stuff goes. This is what the book says. This is how it all works. And it's like, okay, guys, we're going to take that with a gigantic grain of salt, because as far as I can tell, we're just barely scratching the surface of understanding what's going on. And when you look at these ancient structures and you see the precision with which these things were constructed way before the supposed invention of modern technology, it makes you question. And then you look at, wait, what are they actually encoding? Oh, wait, there's mathematical ratios and geometric ratios that are being encoded. And that is very quantifiable, literally, because you can go out there with a measuring device and measure these structures. So it's not speculation. Is this side of this rock this big? Yes. Is this big? Yes. Let's start doing math. And when you do that math, check out the work of Robert Edward Grant and Alan Green, who goes by Bardcode. Those two alone, just those two working together, have pulled out all kinds of mysteries that have been encoded. And I'll just leave you this one little gem to think about, that there was ancient knowledge that got passed down to, like, let's say the Göbekli Tepe builders and the Mesopotamians and the Sumerians, and eventually made it to Egypt. And then Leonardo da Vinci goes to Egypt and studies a whole bunch of stuff. Then he goes back to Europe, and then it hands down and it gets into the work of William Shakespeare, of all people. And then it goes into the work of the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons, and eventually it's the founding fathers. And then they encode that stuff into our founding documents. Yeah, it goes deep. I don't have time to go into this vortex, but check out Alan Green, Bardcode, and Robert Edward Grant. And Alan Green has encoded or decoded the work of William Shakespeare, and most recently, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and found that there's all kinds of very profound ancient knowledge that's been encoded into those documents very directly with the characters and the positioning of clues in the text. And it sounds fantastical, but the data is very tight. And Alan has done a great job researching this stuff, as is Robert, looking at the Great Pyramid and saying, oh, wait a minute, that triangle with that 5284 degree angle there, 5184, that triangle is the exact triangle you need to make, where the area of that triangle is the same area as a circle with that height and a square, if you squared that circle. So there's only one triangle and one square and one circle that have the same area, and it has to be done with that exact geometry. And that is provable. It's there. It's not speculation. It's just straight up. You can't argue with math. And you can't argue with geometry. It's kind of the only two things you can't really argue with. And so when you use those tools to show how profound the insights were of these ancient civilizations, it means that they were aware of really subtle information of the geometry of space-time itself and understanding subtle energy. And perhaps the Great Pyramid was a device for tuning into those energies, that maybe there was a ritualistic and spiritual and philosophical meaning to the pyramid, in addition to whatever technological energies that could have been generated, like understanding how to amplify Earth's energy grid and send it up into space. Nikola Tesla understood what was up with the pyramid. That's why he built his tower in Long Island. And so it goes deep, you guys. It goes all over the map, and it's intricate. It's super intricate. You could talk for a lifetime.
This is great. Jamie, thanks so much. What are you going to be talking about tomorrow at the conference?
I'm going to do kind of what I do when I'm speaking now, and try to pull in a bunch of things and try to connect some dots. Because like I'm saying, there's so many dots and there's so many connections And we're just starting to see how these things are connected. Things that you would think are not connected in any possible way are connected. Like I was saying, the information going through Mesopotamia into Egypt and then into Europe and now to the United States. There's a continuous thread of this information over time. We're riding the front edge of that wave with all these gang tomorrow and during this conference. The folks that are going to be in this stream tomorrow are super profound researchers that each have a deep understanding of a different aspect of this gigantic puzzle.
Wow. Thank you for your time and research and inquisitive mind and putting it all together. So Adam, what can we learn from studying? What do you, I mean, Jamie gave a great outline, but what do you think we can bring into today's world?
Yeah. No, I mean, Jamie built the foundation, and, you know, it's really a lot of it is mathematics, harmonic ratios, understanding of relationships between mathematics and sound. And Jamie, you may not know this one, but I discovered that John Dee was actually a student of Gemma Frisius, and so was Mercator. They were both students who traveled to stay with Gemma. Gemma was dying, right? And there's this little weird gap period where they were training with him, and then Gemma dies in 5 years later. And then that period of years, Gemma ends up giving all of his work and his research to John Dee and Mercator, which essentially was a navigation set of rings and also this staff that could be used to triangulate. And Gemma wrote all of the mathematics for triangulation. So my theory is that Gemma and Dee and Mercator went to Egypt and measured the Great Pyramid precisely with Gemma's triangulation staff to be able to do it properly, right? And so Dee would have at that point a total updated map of exactly the size of all the pyramids to then go back and work with, you know, De Vere and et cetera, and the rest of the crew that Alan talks about. So anyway, I just wanted to drop that for you and for anybody else studying that mystery series. It's amazing.
You think they were measuring that before the casing stones were taken off?
Good question. I mean, it's tough to say whether that's true at that particular period. I think the casing stones may have already been removed by that time, but again, I'm not totally certain at that particular period and that date, or when the date of the casing stone removal was. But that's well after Da Vinci, right? And so those guys having an accurate measurement of the pyramid would have been critical to do the level of mathematics that Dee then encrypted into the cover of the sonnets and so on and so forth.
Wait, I just want to say, I heard the casing stones fell in an earthquake sometime in 10th century, and they were used to build some of the mosques in Cairo. The Mosque of Ali actually has some of the ancient alien writing inside what looks like the limestone casing stones that were on the pyramid.
I think it was more like people were lazy and they didn't want to have to go cut new stones, and they just mined all the casing stones to build the temples in Cairo. Because, like, as far as I can tell, all around the world, right, you go to Peru and you've got the Incas, and they build these walls on top of older walls, and you go, these Incas were not very good at building compared to the stuff that they put the wall on top of. So there's Inca and pre-Inca. There's dynastic Egypt and pre-dynastic Egypt. And in Indonesia, you've got Gadang Padang, where they had a temple, and then they built a temple on top of that, and then another temple, and another temple. And a lot of pyramids are like turduckens. They're just like pyramids on top of pyramids on top of pyramids, because they're like, ooh, that's a sacred site. Let's build our new temple on top of that old one, like Baalbek. The Romans were like, oh, these are great foundation stones. Let's put our temples on top of that. Like, this is
and I know we got to wrap the panel, so I'll just finish what I was saying, which is that, you know, you're right, Jamie, as you go under and you go older, what we find is more and more advanced knowledge in terms of mathematical ratios, proportions, dimensions, and intentionality with that, with ratios to planetary orbits, to the size of the Earth, to the awareness of the moon. There's a level of integrative knowledge that's present there that is really the thing that we're missing most now. And this is where I want to end it, is that we have this vast array of specializations and knowledge and experiences and technologies and engineering approaches and biology and all of our sciences are exploding. Everything is going off like bonkers right now. And what's really missing is an integrative perspective of how it all fits together, which is why Jamie and I are so passionate about unified physics, because it says, hey, there's a way to stitch together our entire understanding, the entire fabric of understanding of our reality into a coherent whole. And for me, because I straddle the bounds of the unified physics and the metaphysics and sociology and philosophy, I'm able to play in spaces that other physicists won't go, including getting data from people's past life memories, including getting data from ancient mythological architecture and from mythological stories that we don't believe are true, and yet tell us deep and profound things about that culture and point to potentially galactic civilizations, the advanced Atlantean civilization. And we get a ton of evidence when we're willing to actually just expand our view a little bit around what could be evidence from a culture and what is not. What if we took their direct stories they're trying to tell us and that they've left for us over thousands of years as more than just hallucinations, right? Or as more than just stories that they told because they just needed to have a good tale around the fire about their gods and goddesses. No, what if those gods and goddesses, what if the stories, what if the tales are true to an extent? What if they really are trying to point us to real events happening? And that for me has been a game changer, because I started to take stories like the Tuatha De Danann arriving in the British Isles and coming in riding clouds and landing on the Iron Mountain and bringing with them 4 sacred treasures from 3 islands in the sky as a little bit more literal. Maybe it wasn't just they burned their ships because why? Because they just decided to, and that made clouds or something, which is currently what archaeology describes it as. And why, if these things weren't important, is there such a powerful link to the tarot, for example? The roots of magic and archetypal understanding come from the 4 sacred treasures of the Tuatha De Danann, right? And so there is a bridging, an integration bridging that we need to do now. And that integration is just the most essential thing that we can do that has been shown to us to be possible from a lot of these ancient civilizations.
Wow. That's exciting. That is really exciting. What are you going to be addressing this weekend or this
Well,
week?
I'm going to be telling a lot of that story, taking us, I'll be doing a similar presentation as to the one that I did in the pyramid at Las Vegas, looking at a sequence of evidential points in spaces that I've been to personally around the world, talking about my experience of those sites and my theory as well as other theories about those sites, and then point to how a lot of them seem to be pointing us to the stars, and that there is an origin point among the stars, and that is a critical piece of our human civilization history that may not be being really dealt with in a professional way at this time.
Wow, this is fantastic. You guys are great. This is just a little taste, if you're watching, of what the next 3 days are going to be with 20 different speakers. Sign up at portaltoascension.org, the True World History Conference. I've been talking to Jamie Janover and Adam Apollo. I'm Alan Steinfeld, and you can subscribe to this channel or Portal to Ascension or New Realities. But really fantastic conversation. Thank you both, and to be continued. And maybe we will learn the true world history as disclosure comes forward, as we understand these different civilizations, as we start to investigate their technologies and their anti-gravity propulsion systems. All that will reveal possibly more of who we are as human beings in our past. That's what I'm hoping. So thanks again, Adam, Jamie, Neil.
Great to see you, Jamie.
And,
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So this weekend will be Desiree and JJ Hertog, Neil Gar, Paul Wallace, Dr. Sam from the Bosnian Pyramids, Freddie Silver, Brad Olson, Michael Tellinger we talked about, lots more. Thank you all for tuning in. Neil, thank you. Talk to you
Thanks,
soon.
Neil.
Thanks.